93-year-old veteran bullied by bikers until he makes a shocking phone call. The sun was setting over the quiet town of Willow Creek, its golden rays casting long shadows on the pavement. For most of the town's residents, this was just another peaceful evening. But for 93-year-old Walter Higgins, a retired World War II veteran, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Walter had lived in the same house for over 50 years. It was small, with a porch swing and a well-kept lawn, but it held decades of memories of his late wife, Margaret, and the children they had raised together. But now, a different kind of presence was invading his peace. For weeks, a gang of bikers had taken over the abandoned lot across from his house. They weren't just harmless motorcycle enthusiasts, they were loud, destructive, and, worst of all, disrespectful. Walter had seen them harass the local grocery store owner, rev their engines late into the night, and even steal packages off porches. At first, he tried to ignore them. What could an old man do against a gang of young troublemakers? But when they started targeting him directly, he knew he had to take action. The bullying started small. One evening, Walter stepped onto his porch to find his trash cans knocked over, garbage strewn across his yard. He sighed, assuming it was raccoons, until he spotted a cigarette but with a distinct skull logo stamped on the filter. The same logo was on the jackets the bikers wore. Then, they started making crude jokes whenever he passed by. "Hey, Grandpa, still think you can walk without a cane?" one sneered. "Maybe we should help him, send him rolling down the street," another laughed. Walter ignored them, keeping his head high. But the harassment escalated. One morning, he found deep scratches along the side of his old pickup truck. Another night, they threw beer bottles at his fence, shattering glass across his yard. Walter wasn't afraid. He had seen worse horrors in war, but he was angry. This was his home, and he wasn't going to let some thugs push him around. The final straw one evening, as Walter sat on his porch reading, he heard the unmistakable rumble of motorcycles approaching. He looked up to see the gang pulling into his driveway. The leader, a burly man with tattoos up his arms, smirked. "Old man, we've been thinking. This place? It'd make a real nice clubhouse. Maybe you should think about moving." Walter clenched his jaw. "Not happening." The leader chuckled. "See, we weren't a skin. We're telling you." Walter stood up, gripping his cane. "You boys think you're tough because you ride loud bikes and push people around?" He took a deep breath. "I've fought men twice your size and 10 times as dangerous. If you think I'm scared of you, you're dumber than you look." The gang laughed, but their amusement faded when Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I wasn't going to do this," he said, shaking his head, "but you leave me no choice." He dialed a number, pressed the speaker button, and waited. The bikers leaned in, curious. The call was answered on the first ring. "Alpha Team, Commander Stevens speaking." The leader of the gang frowned. "What the?" Walter smirked. "This is Sergeant Higgins. I need a favor." Silence. Then, the voice on the other end replied, "Say no more, sir. We're on our way." The shocking arrival, the bikers exchanged confused glances. "Who was that?" one muttered. Walter simply sat back down, a knowing smile on his face. "You'll see." 15 minutes later, the sound of engines roared down the street, but this time, it wasn't the bikers. A convoy of motorcycles, trucks, and military vehicles came rolling in, carrying men in leather jackets emblazoned with a different emblem, the Veteran Brotherhood Riders. A group of ex-military men who had formed a motorcycle club to protect veterans in their communities. Leading them was Commander Stevens, a former Marine who had served under Walter in Korea. The bikers' confidence evaporated as they realized they were now outnumbered by trained soldiers. Stevens got off his bike and walked straight up to the gang leader. "You messing with our sergeant?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. The leader stammered. "We didn't know." "You didn't know?" Stevens cut him off. "This man here fought for this country. He's the reason you have the freedom to act like punks. And now, you're going to show some respect." The gang leader swallowed hard. His crew shuffled behind him, uncertain. Stevens turned to Walter. "What do you want us to do, Sarge?" Walter thought for a moment, then nodded toward the road. "I think these boys should find a new hangout." Stevens grinned. "You heard the man. Move." The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They jumped on their motorcycles and sped away, disappearing into the night. Stevens turned back to Walter. "You okay, sir?" Walter chuckled. "Better than ever." The Veteran Brotherhood Riders stayed for a barbecue that night, filling Walter's yard with stories, laughter, and the kind of camaraderie he had missed for years. And from that day forward, no one in Willow Creek dared to mess with Sergeant Walter Higgins again. Because he wasn't just an old man, he was a warrior. And warriors never stand alone. A new sense of peace the morning after the confrontation, Walter Higgins woke up to something he hadn't experienced in weeks: peace and quiet. No revving engines, no shattered beer bottles, no taunting laughter. He stepped onto his porch, inhaled the crisp morning air, and smiled. The veteran Brotherhood riders had done more than just scare the bikers away. They had made it clear that Walter wasn't alone, that he had an army of brothers watching over him. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed something across the street. The abandoned lot where the bikers had once gathered was empty, except for a single motorcycle left behind, its engine still smoking from the night before. Walter smirked. It seemed in their rush to escape, one of the gang members had been too scared to grab his ride. He was about to head inside when a familiar voice called out, "Mornin', Sergeant." Walter turned to see Commander Stevens leaning against his own motorcycle. His leather jacket, decorated with military patches, caught the early morning light. "Stevens," Walter greeted, shaking his old friend's hand. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." Stevens shrugged. "Wanted to make sure those rats didn't come crawling back. But also, I had an idea." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Stevens gestured toward the abandoned lot. "What if we take this place and turn it into something useful? A veterans clubhouse. A place where guys like us, men who served, can meet, talk, and look out for each other." Walter's expression softened. For years, he had spent his days alone, missing the camaraderie of his brothers in arms. He had lived his life with honor, but old age had a way of making a man feel forgotten. But this was something he could stand behind. "Let's do it," Walter said, his voice firm. The bikers returned over the next few weeks. Walter and the veteran Brotherhood riders worked tirelessly. They cleaned up the lot, set up picnic tables, and even built a small clubhouse. Word spread fast, and soon, veterans from all over Willow Creek started showing up, men from Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The town, once afraid of the gang, now found inspiration in the sight of real warriors standing together. But just as everything seemed to be falling into place, trouble came knocking. One night, Walter was sitting on his porch when he saw headlights approaching. He reached for his cane and stood up, narrowing his eyes. The bikers were back. Their leader, the same tattooed man who had threatened him before, stepped off his bike. His face was bruised, probably from whatever scolding he got for running away like a coward. Walter didn't flinch. "You lost," the leader sneered. "You think you won, old man?" Walter smirked. "Looks like it to me." The biker stepped closer, but before he could take another step, the sound of motorcycles filled the night. The veteran Brotherhood riders had arrived. One by one, they parked their bikes along the street, blocking the gang's exit. Commander Stevens stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "I don't think you boys were invited." The gang leader's bravado faltered. He glanced around, realizing they were outnumbered once again. "I got a better idea," Walter said. "How about you and your boys do something useful for once?" The biker scoffed. "Like what?" Walter pointed at the clubhouse. "You're gonna help us finish what we started." The gang leader blinked in confusion. "You broke this town apart," Walter continued. "Now, you're gonna help us fix it. Or, you can keep running like scared little kids." The bikers exchanged uncertain glances. Then, surprisingly, the leader exhaled sharply and nodded. "Fine. We'll help. But only because we don't want more trouble." Walter chuckled. "Son, you've had enough trouble for a lifetime." The transformation over the next few weeks, something remarkable happened. The bikers, once the town's greatest nuisance, were now putting their muscle to good use. They lifted heavy beams, painted walls, and even helped plant a community garden. At first, they grumbled. But as they worked alongside the veterans, something changed. They began listening to their stories. They started learning about real toughness, not the kind that came from bullying, but the kind forged in battle, in brotherhood, and survival. One night, after a long day of work, the gang leader approached Walter. "I used to think being tough meant making people afraid of you," he admitted. "But, you guys? You're the real deal." Walter placed a firm hand on the young man's shoulder. "Son, it's never too late to turn things around." A legacy lives on. Months passed, and the once abandoned lot had transformed into the Higgins Veterans Center, a place for veterans and troubled youth to come together, learn from each other, and build a better future. Walter, now the honorary head of the center, sat on the porch each evening, watching the next generation grow. The same bikers who had once terrorized him now treated him with respect, some even calling him Sarge out of admiration. And so, the 93-year-old veteran who once stood alone against a gang didn't just win the battle. He changed an entire town. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Months passed, and Willow Creek had changed in ways no one could have predicted. What had once been a quiet town plagued by troublemakers was now a place of unity, respect, and second chances, all because of a 93-year-old veteran who refused to back down. A town transformed. The Higgins Veteran Center became more than just a clubhouse. It became a sanctuary for those who needed purpose. Veterans found support, young men found guidance, and even former bikers, who once caused chaos, now played a role in rebuilding the town. Walter Higgins sat on his usual spot, the wooden porch of the clubhouse, watching a group of young men training with the veterans. They weren't learning how to fight in the streets. They were learning discipline, responsibility, and the value of true strength. Commander Stevens walked up beside him, arms crossed. "Never thought I'd see the day when those punks actually shaped up." Walter chuckled. "People aren't born bad, Stevens. Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them." Stevens nodded. "Well, if anyone could knock sense into him, it'd be you." Walter sipped his coffee, his gaze fixed on the next generation before him. This wasn't just a victory. This was his legacy. A farewell to a hero. One crisp autumn morning, the town awoke to news that shook everyone. Walter Higgins had passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 94. It was a moment of deep sorrow, but also of gratitude. Walter had lived a full life, a brave life, and most importantly, a life that changed others for the better. On the day of his funeral, the streets of Willow Creek were lined with hundreds of people. Veterans, townsfolk, even former gang members stood shoulder to shoulder, paying their respects to the man who had taught them what real honor meant. His casket was escorted not by a hearse, but by motorcycles, a tribute from the veteran Brotherhood riders, who now proudly carried on his mission. As the town gathered to say their goodbyes, Commander Stevens stood before the crowd. His voice was strong, but his heart was heavy. Walter Higgins wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't just a veteran. He was a leader, a mentor, and a man who never stopped fighting for what was right. He may be gone, but his legacy will live on in this town, and in all of us. The moment of silence that followed was broken only by the rumble of motorcycles as the riders performed a final honor ride, their engines roaring one last time for the man who had taught them all the true meaning of courage. And so, the story of Walter Higgins, the warrior who never stood alone, came to an end. But his impact? That would never fade. Legends never die.